What's your childhood mystery that you finally solved years later? My dad used to occasionally burst out with this one line of a song. Barnacle Bill the Sailor. Only ever that line. When I was 6 or so I asked him why, and he said it was an old drinking song that was absolutely filthy, and I was too young to hear the rest of it. This continued once or twice a year until I was 18. I told him I was an adult now, and he could tell me the rest of the song. I distinctly remember him looking up from the newspaper, sighing and folding it, then going, "The truth is I can never remember the rest of the song," and then went right back to reading the newspaper. The weird smell that I referred to as a stinky cheese smell were probably a symptom of seizures. I would happen maybe twice a year. It's not really like cheese. It's like a smell that isn't a smell. IDK how to even describe it. It was so minor parents disregarded it. I can remember it starting in 2nd grade. I suddenly started having it a lot more as an adult when I hit 28 and got diagnosed 2 years later after symptoms became way more extreme. Makes so much sense now. The entire time I lived in my childhood home, my mom hid my Christmas presents in her secret hiding place. She made it sound mystical and mysterious a few months ago. A while after I moved out, she finally told me what the secret hiding place actually was. The Christmas tree box in a cabinet in the garage. She would replace the Christmas tree with my presents when she put the tree up. I remember being about 8 and in the car with my dad. I was in the front seat and we were driving somewhere, and this song came on the radio. He cranked it and said something about it being the best guitar playing ever. He really jammed out, which was really uncharacteristic because he was usually so stoic. It was the only time I heard the song, and he died before I could ever ask him what song it was. When I asked around, no one knew WTF I was talking about or what song I was thinking of. So I had this melody in my head for years. But how do you look up a song that has no lyrics? So for years and years, this song stayed on the back burner in my brain. I was afraid to forget it. Somehow this story pops up when I'm like 26 or so, chatting with my husband, and we searched YouTube for best guitar songs. After about 15 minutes, we find it. Cliffs of Dover was the song that I'd burned into my brain on repeat for 16 years. Now I jam out to it with my kids. Growing up I always insisted I liked the mashed potatoes at my grandma's house better than the ones my mom made at home. My grandma once told me it's because she uses a special recipe. I found out last year that my mom hand mashes her potatoes. My grandma just gets the Betty Crocker boxed speep. Her special recipe, I was gonna get what she does, is Betty Crocker. When I was younger, like 4 or 5, my family had a pet turtle. One day the turtle went missing, and my parents told me it climbed the wall in our backyard and went to the creek behind our house. I, being a naive toddler child, did not question this logic. Fast forward to when I was 17 and driving with my mom in the car. We saw a tortoise crossing the street, and I was suddenly thrown back to my memory of us having a pet turtle. I pulled over to save the tortoise and was all OMG mom, turtles can't climb walls. What happened to our turtle? Came to find out it had burrowed a hole in our lawn, and my dad didn't notice it until after he ran it over with a lawnmower. Obviously it was easier to pick up the pieces and tell your kid it climbed the wall than admit you murdered it with a lawnmower. When I was in elementary school, I always wondered what the teacher's staff room was like. It seemed so mysterious, and I remember trying to get a peek any time I walked by and the door would open. Later became a teacher and can fully confirm they're dull, often toxic spaces full of cranky teachers complaining about students. Not the biggest mystery, but one day my friend was over in my house playing video games. My mom called us over to her room to help flip the mattress over. So we did. We then went to another friend's house. My mom calls that friend and says, "There was two $20 bills on top of the dresser. Did you get them?" I said no. I asked my friend. He said no. Like 5 minutes later, my friend says if we want to go to the toy store because he has $40 into $20 bills. I say yes, and we go, and he buys me a yo-yo or something. It took me years to finally realize that my friend stole the money. Reverse of this. As a kid, my dad would call me from the other side of the house to bring him something to drink from the kitchen. He always drank from a straw, and about first grade, I started getting annoyed at this, so I started poking a tiny hole in his straw as my own little vengeance. I didn't come clean about this until I was like 22 years old. The look on his face was priceless. It's like he instantly snapped back to then and knew exactly what I was talking about and just said, "Son of a, you didn't you?" He just thought we bought cheap straws. I have a reverse one also. Mum used to make those Betty Crocker cakes and I loved eating the batter. I would eat so much of it there would barely be any cake left. She was completely perplexed. Finally she writes a long angry email to Betty Crocker about what a farce their cake mix is because it barely makes a cake big enough to eat. They apologized profusely and sent a bunch of free cake mix. I told her in my late 20s. The look on her face. My father used to take us camping and on hikes and bike rides. He taught us about safety in the woods and on the water and how to navigate using maps. So it wasn't all that strange when he said one day I was maybe 10 we were doing a game where we'd be blindfolded and taken on a drive. The object of the game was to call out what direction we were turning by feel and then ultimately, after driving about 30 minutes give a guess roughly where we were and which direction home was in. He was impressed how well we did, and we took off the blindfolds and went for a hike. I never thought much about it. Years later I realized why we played the game. My dad was in criminal psychology, especially peep offenders. He was kidnap proofing us, but in a light-hearted way so there was no fear or trauma. I visited my dad when I was 6 or 7 years old at the place where he worked, or so I was told. I remember remarking at the time, and people laughed at me, because I said it looked just like a prison. The people laughing were the guards, and I was indeed visiting my dad at Terminal Island Federal Correctional Institution, where he was a federal inmate. I solved a family mystery for my mom. I wasn't allowed to play console video games during the week all the way until I was 18, but some nights I'd really be craving it, so I would noiselessly creep through my house into my basement, where I could play video games in peace. But once every 30 times or so one of my parents would need something from the basement and I'd quickly turn off the TV monitor, hide in the guest room and pray they didn't turn on a light or notice the box was on. One night I ducked into the guest room and hid behind the bed. To my horror my mom followed me into the room and turned on the lights. I was panicking so when she started digging through the closet with her back to me, I made a run for it. I nearly brushed her shirt, and if she'd seen me, I'd probably have given her a heart attack. But I made it, and kept going all the way to bed. About 5 years went by and my mom said something, like "You're such a quiet walker," and I told her it was because of my basement trips thinking I had nothing to lose. My mom's face went kinda solemn, and when I explained she said so there really was someone down there. And she explained that she remembered that exact night and the feeling that there was a ghost in the room. Over the next couple days she'd stare into space and just say, "I can't believe you were really there." She seemed to get over it, but she probably checks empty rooms closer now. My mom used to call us in for dinner by yelling out the back door from the kitchen. I was in middle school before I realized the screen door was actually called a screen door. When I was really young, me and my siblings would play in my grandparents' yard. My grandfather would tell us to stay away from the skunk hole at the edge of the yard. We lived in South Texas so this wasn't something out of the ordinary, and we just avoided it like any other animal home. Years later it dawned on me. It was actually the septic tank access. We grew up poor, and at the age of 10 my friends were all having these crazy birthday parties with petting zoos, bounce houses, clowns, etc. So my mother, who is very resourceful, decided I would have a sleepover for my 11th birthday. It was great, and we were gonna make ice cream cones. So we got all the stuff out with my mom, and my mother opened up the box of cones, and they were all smashed up. She said that we weren't having regular ice cream, We were having Magic Castle sundaes because the broken ice cream cones resembles the sections of a castle. We all thought this was great, and we had them. When my friends went home, they asked their parents to make Magic Castle sundaes. 2 days ago I found out that my mother was getting the past sell-by foods behind the grocery store. They were not expired, just past sell-by date. She had no idea that the cones were brown up until she opened them with us. She thought of the Magic Castle idea quickly, and we all loved it. Just goes to show how stupid kids are, lol. The reason my aunt punched her husband at the pool during a huge family vacation. It was because she found out that the long distance charges to the hotel room they shared had a ton of calls to a woman he was known was swell. Not sure if this is considered a mystery or not. My mother, who passed about in 2009, used to make a meatloaf every single year on Groundhog's Day. Every single year. Every single year she would tell us it was groundhog, and I always thought it just tasted like ground beef. But I was kid. I'm 33 now. Last year I said something to my brother about it and asked if he knew where mom got the groundhog. I wanted to do that for son. My brother had no idea what I was talking about. I told him about it and he started laughing. My wife started laughing. My own son, who didn't know why, started laughing. Mom got me good. Mystery solved. It was just regular meatloaf. When I was 10, my godfather gave me $20 as a Christmas gift. At the end of the dinner the money had disappeared. 4 years my parents blamed me for being irresponsible with my money. Years later we figured out, after she was caught stealing stuff from my aunt's house, that my cousin's fiancé at the time is a kleptomaniac. Turns out she was the one that stole the money. When my brother, my sister and I were kids there was the incident of the little M's apostrophe. I must have been about 5 years old, my brother 7, and my sister 9. One evening my mum had been decorating the living room, and about halfway up the wall were these little squiggles that appeared in pencil on the freshly painted wall. They went the whole way along the wall and the entire way around the room. When my mum saw them, she hit the roof. There was hours of screaming and grilling and trying to get one of us to confess to writing on the wall. I was the prime suspect being so young. But on closer inspection the little squiggles looked like little M's apostrophe. With my sister's name beginning with M, she was also a suspect. My mum sent us all to our room to talk through which one of us was going to confess. When we all get to our bedroom we quickly figured out none of us had done it. We knew one of us had to confess because my mum was, well, bats beep crazy. So me being the youngest took one for the team as we had decided I would be punished the least. Many years later we asked her about it. She admitted that she had figured out the next day that it had bled through the painting from underneath. Someone must have marked a border around the room. Possibly for a dado rail or something. We laughed it off. But we were pretty pissed she didn't admit it and apologize at the time. Until my mum finally shed light on it. My brother, my sister and I would sometimes say to each other remember the little M's? In such a world-weary way. I live and grew up in the deep south. As a child from earliest memories until about 8, we would take a winter trip up to Stourmont to see the grandparents. I would have scary nights hearing ghosts wailing outside the windows. It was terrifying. GPs moved south and we stopped going. When I was in my 30s I took another trip up to Vermont. First night stay, I heard the ghosts. Turns out the winter winds up north are way different than the winds of southern nights. Suddenly my general fear of the dark disappeared as I realized fully what the source of the sound was. When I was 4, I vividly remember getting into my mum's car and her telling me that our cat had died. She told me how she rushed him to the vet and he was shedding fur. Something was seriously wrong. Despite her best efforts he died. I never knew why he died and why it happened so suddenly, but I accepted that it happened. Fast forward about 15 years. I'm home from college for Christmas. On Christmas Eve, I'm out driving to the store with my dad and uncle. They are talking about the cat my parents got for Christmas one year, the cat mentioned above. My dad says yeah, that thing was too aggressive. So I took it to a farm and gave it away. Normally, when the family pet dies, the parents lie to the kid and say it went to a farm upstate somewhere to ease the burden. Not my parents. They told me the horrifying truth even though it wasn't, true. I was watching Star Trek TNG with my dad when someone told Riker to wash his back. When I asked my father why someone would say that to another person, he said so you can smell someone coming up behind you. It wasn't until years later that I understood how easy it was to hear just how committed my dad was to willfully deceiving his children for personal satisfaction. One evening when camping, my brother caught a fish that we decided to keep alive in the cooler for some reason. Well, the next morning we ran out to see the fish, and it had grown like 5 inches. We were so excited and didn't know how the fish grew that much overnight. Last year we brought it up, and my dad said that he had got up that morning and seen the fish being taken by a raccoon, and that he spent the next hour or so frantically fishing for another one. He said he caught the new fish, the first one he was able to catch, just a few minutes before we got up. I had never questioned that the fish growing that much as I grew up, but after hearing what really happened I did feel like we probably should have wondered about that more. When I was like 8 or so, I answered our house phone, and it was a man who asked to speak to my mom. Didn't ask for her by name. Said back quote, "Could I speak to your mom, please?" I asked who it was, and he said back quote, "It's Santa Claus." I was so excited and ran to my mom, and I was telling all my friends for days that Santa Claus had called my house. This led me to believe in Santa for a few years longer than most kids normally do. I was heartbroken when I found out that Santa wasn't real. Years and years later I remembered to ask my mom who had called that day and said they were Santa Claus. It was our Reverend, and my mom was a deacon. He had known me for years, so recognized my voice when I answered and knew what age I was. It had never occurred to me. As a kid, I played Medal of Honor, Allied Assault with my brother. We got to the 5th level, which took place in a rainy French city similar to Saving Private Ryan. However, we always got stuck on the first objective, which was to locate the bazooka team. There were no clues as to where this team was in a giant rubble-filled city with poor visibility. To make things worse, hidden enemy snipers would constantly fire at you, making the search much more difficult than it already was. My brother and I practically scoured every nook and cranny, but we never found this team. If the bazooka team was trying to stay hidden, they were doing a good job. In the months that followed, we reinstalled and replayed the game several times, but would always get stuck on that level. Fast forward several years, and I got the digital version of Allied Assault for nostalgia's sake. I dreaded playing the 5th level, but to my surprise, I easily cleared the first objective by happening across the corpses of the bazooka team in one of the buildings. Turns out the CD we originally played on was bugged where the bodies never even rendered into the game. All we did was waste several hours looking for a group of people that never made it to the battle in the first place. Giddy at the prospect of finally completing the game, I happily continued the level only to quit when I kept getting sniped by those damn hidden snipers. Mystery of why my mom never ordered anything for herself and was never hungry whenever she took my sister and I to eat out. 25 years later, she told me she really was hungry and wanted to eat too, but she only had enough money to feed the 2 of us. She didn't want us to feel guilty. I love my mom so much. I have huge gaps in my memories as a child. Like, weirdly inexplicable ones that always felt weird. Not just basic forgetting stuff. I've had a few instances of this happening as an adult as well. Welp. Turns out I have a dissociative disorder and that can cause amnesia. My dad used to say he could stop the rain for a moment by snapping his fingers. He'd do it in the car when it was pouring. I was so mesmerized. Told all my friends about it well into late elementary school. I've since realized he'd snap as we drove underneath an overpass. Not mine, but my husband's. I hope he doesn't see this, because then my cover is blown. He said in middle school, there was a time that he'd get pulled out of class to shoot free throws in the gym. Only him. He didn't think this was strange. but didn't understand why he was the only one that got to do that. Turns out, his parents told his teachers he couldn't participate in Peep Edition. Haha. When I was a kid in the 70s, my parents worked in Canada's Arctic, but were from Nova Scotia. I had a pet mouse, Pixie. Pixie died the night before our family flew home to Nova Scotia for summer vacation. It was many years later before I realized that probably wasn't a sad coincidence. John Travolta was actually John Travolta, which really made a lot more sense. Who ate all the cherries in the cherry cake? I was blamed for this 4 years after someone picked out all of the cherries and ate them during a family Christmas party. 8 years later, my little sister confessed to me that it had been her. My dad is an ex-Catholic, and every night when he tucked me in until I left the house, he'd say, "We love you. God bless you. Good night." And I was always wondering why, since he had stopped going to church long ago. Fast forward to me being 28 years old and watching an old Bruce Springsteen concert together, one of his favorite artists, and Bruce says, "We love you. God bless you. Good night." At the end of his set, I turned my head towards my dad and asked if this is why he said that 4 years to me at night. He laughed and said, "I have no original material." I remember there was a time where I had to start asking to go play in the backyard when I was about 6 to 7, maybe 8, with my siblings, so she could supervise us. We never had to do this previously, so my siblings and I were very confused, and anytime we didn't ask, she got us in big trouble. Turns out the neighbors were harboring an known pedophile in their house, and that's why mom got so upset with us going outside without asking. I have no idea if this man was on the run or not from the authorities. My mom probably had no idea either. Though if she knew he was on the run, she for sure would have tipped the authorities. Mom did catch the man having peep with a teen on our front lawn and called the police. Not sure what happened after that. Also, at this time my neighbors did not have a child of their own. I've always wanted to know what was behind the ATMs at a bank, how it worked and where did the money come from. I grew up and worked at a bank just to find out some fat dude had to squeeze behind the ATMs to refill it. Me. My uncle, single/no kids, lived a few houses away from my grandparents, so my siblings and I would go between the houses and always loved my uncle's house because he had a huge fish tank of tropical fish and let us play video games. He was the most fun uncle there was, always taking us to the movies, amusement parks, fishing, golfing, and was so fun to be around. Always had us rolling with laughter. But over time he became less okay with us popping over, and we resorted to sneaking into his house. We didn't get far along, and he was pissed. From that point on, we always just saw him in my grandparents' house. We used to joke with him about having a girlfriend over. Fast forward 17 years later, he had a massive heart attack, and while he was in the hospital, his sisters went into his house to look for paperwork and get the house ready for his return. There they found rooms full of empty bottles of cheap vodka. My uncle had severe alcoholism for years and none of us knew it. And suddenly so many little things started making sense. He ended up dying shortly thereafter of organ failure brought on by alcoholism. Wasn't even 60 yet. 9/10 times it wasn't a skunk. I had meningitis when I was 2 years old, and my baby brother had it also and he died. I had the viral form. He had the bacterial form. I grew up thinking I had it first, and always felt like I gave it to him, and was the reason he died. I know, but you can't help what you think, especially when you're a kid. It wasn't until I was an adult that I learned that he actually had it before me. I don't know why no one had ever told me that before, except maybe they didn't, because they weren't aware that I always harbored this guilt about it, since I kept everything inside. Not one person had ever mentioned to me that he had died before I got it, or maybe I was in the hospital when he died. That part still isn't clear to me. I was in the hospital for about 3 weeks, so it could have been before or during my hospital stay. I used to go to our local YMCA after school, and during the summer, when I was a kid, we went swimming in the pool almost every day, and being the curious kid I was, I always wondered what was behind the caution doors with the weird triangle markings. Fast forward 8 years, and I'm now working at that YMCA as a lifeguard. And behind the doors? Old, smelly pool chemical testing rooms. Very anticlimactic. The smell of my neighbor's house growing up was actually the smell of some dank ass weed. In preschool I had a substitute teacher who had a long pinky nail. I asked him how come, and he told me it just grows faster. Years later I realized. My dad and sister used to play pranks on my dad's secretary. When we grew up he admitted that he was having an affair with her. It makes my skin crawl thinking that he used my oblivious little sister to flirt with this woman behind our mother's back. I wasn't a kid anymore. But some years back, when my mom was terminally ill, my family was receiving food-based gifts from a lot of our friends. Prep dinners, baked snacks, a restaurant gift card or two. The usual support friends extend when people they care about are going through tough times. For a long time I remember dad asking me if I'd tried any pastries we'd gotten from some family friends. We'll call them the Nelsons. I'll let him know they were a little dry but very tasty. And he chuckled. It stuck with me because it was an odd question and reaction. It wasn't until a couple years later, spacing out driving home, that I remembered dad's bizarre reaction and the fact that the Nelsons had suggested easing some of mom's pain with marijuana, which they grew at home around the same period. I had eaten pot cookies. I feel like an idiot for not realizing it, and I don't remember anything that happened after I ate the pastries. Every time I saw a car that said sheriff I believed it was, like, the sheriff. Probably because I watched too many westerns. I was a legit adult before I learned about the concept of a sheriff's department. In retrospect, I'm a dumbass. In kindergarten I had a guinea pig that turned into many guinea pigs after I babysat the class guinea pig for Christmas break. Parents were thrilled. Anyway, my teacher took the entire family back to her house and was supposed to sell them, and I would get my original guinea pig back. They never returned, and my parents told me they all got sold together as one big happy family. I didn't find out until I was maybe 25 that a coyote actually got into the cage and they all got eaten together as one big happy family. This is the way. I have two. One, I found these things in my mom's bathroom that I thought were the cowtail candy things, but they didn't have the right label. I asked my mom what it was, and she said I'll tell you when you're older. Realized around 14 that they were tampons. 2 Steely Dan was playing, and I heard my dad say to my mom, "Do you know what a Steely Dan actually is?" And then he whispered to her. Killed me that I didn't know, but I knew it was inappropriate, and he wouldn't tell me. Earlier this year he finally told me that it's a term for a dildo. It's not just a name for any dildo. It's a specific dildo from the novel Naked Lunch. Edit. My bad. It was made of rubber. Perhaps the steely part was referring to its strength. This particular dildo was Steely Dan third. The novel describes the demise of Steely Dan I vaginal grip and Steely Dan second chewed to bits. Mary is strapping on a rubber penis. Backquote. Steely Dan 3 from Yokohama, she says. Then Mary works Steely Dan 3 into Johnny's ass with a series of corkscrew movements of her fluid hips. The more you know. Sparkle sparkle.